Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Natasha, and today I am sharing a conversation that I had with leadership coach and United States Army Sergeant Major Nathaniel Tony Piper. As leaders, it is important to continue to develop our coaching skills because they can be leveraged in many different situations. Good morning, Tony. Thank you for joining me today for this episode. So could you please introduce yourself and tell us how you use coaching as a leader?
Okay, good morning, and thanks for having me. So I'm Nathaniel Anthony Piper, but I go by Tony. My birth parents actually gave me the name Tony. It's not a nickname. Got to get that out there. People always wonder. So I've been in the Army for almost 19 years now, and that's where a bulk of my leadership experience comes from. And currently a Sergeant Major, and I'm the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade Operations Sergeant Major, which just means I'm in charge of all the moving pieces. For anybody that's not familiar with military experience. Now, when it comes to coaching is probably almost my entire day. There's nothing better than when I get into my position, I assess the organization and the individuals in it, and then I kind of figure out kind of the things that they need where I think they can be better. Either it's to improve their weaknesses or capitalize on their strengths. And then, just throughout the day, the week, the month, the year, whatever time frame, I will actually pull individuals aside or teams and just give them 5 minutes to 30 minutes anywhere in that timeline. Coaching tips on just how to improve or be better, or things to consciously think about or to try to build into their battle rhythm so that they become more successful over time and they get used to just doing things better instead of always having to look at their notebook, let's say, or look at a regulation because they don't trust themselves. So we use it to try to help them trust themselves, empower them to take action.
I think sometimes people, when they think of coaching, they either think of sports and you're on the field, or they think of like an executive coaching session where you sit down with somebody and you're there for an hour and, you move through ORID or you move through a framework, in this session. But I think it's like you highlighted something really important, and that's that coaching is everywhere. It's all around us. Like as leaders, we have to take all these opportunities to do these almost focused, laser sessions of how do I ask the right questions or kind of throw out an idea and kind of see how people grab it and run with it.
Yeah, so actually my background probably with coaching is from the sports world because I grew up as an athlete playing soccer, basketball, doing track, and played football there for a little bit in high school. So the interesting thing there is that all of those are team sports except for track. And I think I gained the most on how to coach individuals actually from track versus the team sports. The team sports taught me how to have a high-performing team, but I had to mentally prepare myself to get through any challenge I faced in track because all the events were individual. And, when I made it into the state competition, it was really nerve-wracking. And so I had to be resilient and overcome that. And I've realized that throughout my time now in the Army, the team aspect is always important. It's always going to be there, but it was really that individual aspect and how I can use that to keep myself going forward. I've used that with individuals that I see that are just kind of slumping in the organization. They just don't really know where to go, or they're struggling. So that's been really awesome.
That's such an important distinction too, where yes, we need to be part of a team and we need to learn how to collaborate. And of course, all those good things, because nothing is really done individually. But sometimes leaders, especially people who are aspiring to move up in leadership positions, it is so outward focused, which is great, right? It should be that's why you're leading. But at the same time, there's these aspects of leading yourself as well and kind of learning those tools so that you can be a more effective leader, and then also so that you don't get burnout.
Yeah. And I think it's also important too that one of the things that I've noticed, at least in my time in the military, is that people struggle with being okay with being an individual or being unique and not having it being taken as, oh, you're not a servant leader, you're not doing the right things, you have to take care of the team. But at the same time, if you don't practice good self-care, self-resilience and maintenance, then what are you going to do for the team?
Right. You can't pour from an empty cup. Also, if I'm just like always giving and I'm not actually, not only on the self-care part, but if I'm not taking care to make sure that I know my organization and know the people in it, that's also something that is my responsibility, right? And it's something that's kind of, as in that self-leadership, self-care, it kind of builds your own confidence as well. So I know you and I have talked a lot about mindset, and I love talking about mindset. When you're coaching individuals to be kind of more of an individual, to take care of themselves as leaders, how do you find that their mindset, like kind of where do you think it is when they start, and how do you think it needs to shift to go from fixed to growth?
The younger individuals that I work with start from like the fixed mindset because they're so dead set in their ways, or they're too new to the experience that they don't really trust themselves and make their own decisions, or it's just like, well, I'm a specialist in below, so I have to just take whatever my leaders tell me and then I just use it. And the seniors are like, well, I've been doing this for so long, I know what I'm doing, we're successful, it works, and they just don't want to they don't want to look out and potentially find an area where it's like, oh, okay, you weren't so good at that. And then there's that little sweet spot of individuals that are really kind of like committed to their career, their profession, and they do come into the sessions with a growth mindset, more of asking questions because they're curious, which is awesome, or being willing to take constructive feedback because they know that they can make them better. And it's really fun to watch when an individual starts with like a fixed mindset. So I have a specialist I'm working with now who was very against the Army, what it could do for her based off of her experience with her leaders. But the more we talked, she realized that the power was in her hands to really guide herself throughout her career in the profession. Her mindset has changed. So now she's like, hey, teach me something. Hey, do this for me. Hey, I got a question for you. When we first started talking, it was more of, what do you need Sergeant Major? And so it's fun to watch those transitions take place.
And I appreciate also that you said that when people are junior, sometimes they're just so busy taking in information and they're like, this is what I was told was right, so this is kind of what it is. But also people can stay in that fixed mindset for their whole careers and their whole lives, and then just to be like, well, I have all this experience and I know how it works, instead of acknowledging like how it adapts. And the story of that specialist is like such a good example that once you have more reps, and more experience, but you're actually open to what that experience is teaching you, then that mindset shift can happen.
I think what's interesting too is depending on who comes into an organization or leads it, can also set up the organization at the fixed or growth mindset. Because there's one organization that I went into that it was like pins and needles if you tried to present something that was against what the previous regime had in place, because it was like, no, they told us this is how it's going to work. That's just how it's always been. That's how it's going to be moving forward. They were aggressive in trying to keep us from trying to be innovative and evolve the organization. And it was very interesting. I'll just leave it at that.
Very diplomatically put.
It's just something you got to, be careful of, though, from a leadership aspect. If you are the senior coming into organizations, if you don't set the culture right, then you set yourselves up to have an organization that's like that. And then even when you leave, and if you happen to come back, because the world could be small that you operate in, and if you come back, you have to be careful because you may have grown and evolved on the outside, but that organization just stayed in that fixed mindset mentality that you set up initially. So even they could reject you and come back into the organization.
Sometimes it's not that you've changed and you've grown, but it's how other things have stayed the same that can be so frustrating. And I think you highlighted the point too, or highlighted a point that there is a certain amount of also like psychological safety in an organization that really is, I'm going to say, required for people to continue to have that growth mindset. So like your mindset is yours and you determine, how it's going to be, and your experience has helped determine that as well. But when you're in an organization and you're trying to even say something that just could be a little bit different or whatever, and people shut that down, well, then you've also stopped contributing to the organization. So what they're really doing is their organizations like that will make not only team members ineffective with actually offering like good feedback, and then they're shutting down engagement. But as those people kind of shut down, this is kind of like the inverse of the specialist story though, where it's like, then they're like, oh, this is what organizations like this, people like this, and I'm doing all that in quotes, but it's like, then they think they're like, that's what it's like. So therefore in those situations, why bother, right? Like, why bother having a growth mindset, or why bother offering anything, even if I had it? I know that you also lead groups for the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club, and you're a Sergeant Audie Murphy Club member. What is the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club and why it's important? But then also, as far as the individuals who come into the study sessions and who really would like to develop to be a part of that club, how do you help develop them to have more of that growth mindset? And how do you kind of coach them through that?
I'll be honest, I'm still trying to figure out what the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club really means to me. It's a lead organization, it's your best non-commissioned officers across the Army. And that's something that I somewhat understand and I accept because of the process and the study that they go through in the boards, because the boards are nothing that I've ever really seen before. Depth of knowledge you have to demonstrate in those boards is pretty in-depth. It's nice when you see somebody that's capable of answering a question that shows that they have knowledge, experience, and the right behaviors to get after a problem set. There's just like this consistency that's brought in by the members of the organization where they all have a good skill set and they kind of blend them together and they just get after taking care of the community, development soldiers, and future leaders. And then when it comes to the study sessions, what I find is that a majority of the group is actually there trying to expand their mindset and their knowledge because they actually want to use the information. It's just trying to get them past you're learning it for the board because you want to pass that board, and get them into the mindset of, I'm learning it to pass the board, and I'm actually learning this to just be a good leader. That's always been my key with mentoring and coaching individuals, is that don't ever prep anybody for a promotion board. Promotion boards are going to come and go. The longer you stay in, the more chance you have to go to a promotion board. So don't worry about that. Just worry about learn what you can through experience, through education, and just curiosity, so that when you get put into a situation, even if you have never seen it before, you have an increased chance of being successful. Because that's what it's all about, being a leader. Try to gain as much knowledge and experience that you can. So when you get the situation, you increase your chances of being a positive influence.
It reminds me of the Simon Sinek book, The Infinite Game. If you're just doing this to get through this day, to get through this board, to accomplish this task, then part of me thinks like, what's the point? If it's just for this one thing, this finite thing, but if you can go into it, but not attached to like this outcome, like I'm becoming a better leader so I can get promoted, is very different than I'm becoming a better leader because I want to be a better leader.
Yeah, one thing too, I think that's been interesting since I actually started working with the Audie Murphy Club is that they were more of, I would say, a finite type mindset when it came to their studying. Like they had a plan in place and it seemed pretty good. But as I was observing, a lot of the questions still centered around, if I can answer this question, then I'm good. And there was nothing to it other than they asked them a question, they pointed to a regulation, and they gave their answer. And there was none of this, what if I just sit you in a scenario? And then you actually have to use 5 or 6 different regulations or policies or an external resource to actually get after this answer. Because that's really what it's about. Like you have to be able to, you will rarely take on one thing inside your organization by yourself as an individual. You're usually going to have a team. And if you know how to tap into that team, then again, you increase your chances of having success. And that's one thing that I've been pushing with that. With the Audie Murphy Club, it's like, hey, you guys are this elite premier organization, so now you actually have to use that to your advantage. Figure out who's good at what, and then continue to network and use that network whenever you're presented with the situation. Don't just come in, get a medallion, and then try to operate like, oh, I'm Audie Murphy and I'm just, a badass. Because then you're not you're not using the club to your advantage, and that's what it's there for. So if 3 individuals are good at one thing, to do something where you're going to use those 3 individuals and just use that team. It's all about the team.
You make a great point there where it's like, it not only is me understanding what the policies and the regulations are, but it's understanding like how to leverage those, but also a ton of soft skills, the emotional intelligence, your cognitive biases, all these other things that really play into how we interact. So I think scenario-based questions, especially when you're developing leaders or coaching leaders, is important because then you really see like how they work through that problem. And then that's like such a great opportunity to coach. And I think that clubs like the Audie Murphy Club are great because in that process of trying to attain membership, you have the opportunity, I should say, to learn a lot about where you stand as a leader and what your gaps are that you need to fill.
I think that's one thing that's been interesting is there's been quite a few that have joined as candidates in this particular association. They came in thinking they were the best of the best, and then they went through a couple of questions with the standing members and realized they have a lot of work to do. So on the flip side, it's also good to see them being humbled, and I think that's the humility that they have to either accept or they reject and they move on is important, and that's something that a lot of soldiers don't get when they are doing their regular promotion board study. Is they don't get humbled because they never go in front of a group that can actually shut them down like that or show them that, hey, you have a lot of room to grow in terms of your knowledge or your experience. Now, to get away from the Army, so I worked at Kmart before I joined. This is where I realized that having a fixed mindset really actually hindered me when I thought that I was more mature and better. So I was a menswear department manager of all things. At a store in Fort Collins, Colorado. This was at the time when Kmart they were getting ready to declare bankruptcy, and I was in college, and I didn't really know what to do with myself at that point in time in my life, right? And so what I had noticed is that I kind of shut down and I withdrew inside myself. But when I did that, not realizing how influential I could be as a person, I was very vocal inside that organization. And because I wasn't willing to accept some of the things that were going on around me, and I just wanted things to be a certain way, and everything had to be chaotic because I thrive in chaos. It's like that's the environment I created. It wasn't until I left and I was in the Army and I realized I did a really bad thing there because everybody that was on the soft lines with me, we were all very negative. And I was like one of the primary players in that. And if I could go back knowing what I know now, I would have got in there, observed what was going on, had the emotional intelligence to do my reflection, right? And then realized that I was making some poor decisions, and I would have acknowledged that, and then would have came in there with an entirely different mentality and tried to actually shape the culture for the better. So it's been interesting to have that experience because I like to share it with individuals that are struggling inside of the organizations that they're in because they can't see past that organization. They don't realize that there's something else out there. So I share that with them, like, you might be creating it for yourself.
And I think looking back at these different opportunities that we had, where at the time, of course, we didn't realize it was an opportunity. We were just in it. And especially as a younger person, I always say that when I was younger, I've always really loved leadership. But there was a time, I would say probably, teenage, early college years, where going after leadership meant something different. The way that you interact when you kind of have that mindset is very different than how you interact when you've had a few leadership reps under your belt, right? You've been around for a couple cups of coffee. I don't even remember who I was talking to the other day, but he was like, well, what are the perks of this position? And I was like, it's leadership. There's no perks per se. You're helping other people, you're helping the organization, you have opportunities to grow and develop, but people get caught up in these perks and then they kind of forget that that's not what leadership is.
It's kind of like in Simon Sinek's book with the Why University class about the porcelain cup. It's like, I realized that I don't have a porcelain cup. I'm just a styrofoam cup. I don't take those perks. It's like, that's unique to me. So here's the backtrack a little bit. Another reason why I love coaching as a leader, because there are a lot of people that are in right now that, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, right? Not ignoring, but there's my opinion that a lot of people think that the way that they're successful in the military will translate to success in the corporate world and things like that. It's not going to happen. You have to understand that those cultures and what matters in the corporate world is completely different than what we care about in the military. And so it's just something where, again, if you have that growth mindset, then as you transition out, you'll start to just naturally look at the things that are available to you and gain an understanding of the situation you may or may not choose to go into. And then when you get there, you'll be more willing to acknowledge that, oh, okay, I don't got it here.
I think people, they think that there's this equal translation from one industry to the next. But even from, if somebody is a CEO in the corporate world, that doesn't automatically mean they'd be a great general or command sergeant major in the military. And really, when they're looking at your experience, what they're looking for is how adaptable are you? Can you learn? Like all these different things. One of my favorite examples of exactly what you're talking about is Dwight Eisenhower. He was, I mean, we all know, Supreme Allied Commander. He did everything in the Army you could possibly do, right? American hero, great military leader. When he left and he became the president of Columbia University, it did not go well for him. But it was interesting because while people respect your service, but it didn't matter that he was the Supreme Allied Commander. It was a completely different place to be operating, and what they were looking for was these leadership qualities of being able to adapt and move an organization forward.
Yeah, actually, so that's one of the things too that I've noticed with the Audie Murphy Club, at least the one that I've been a part of, is that I think they're starting to understand now that just because you're a member of Audie Murphy doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful as a leader. It's funny that in the Army we have like the leader requirements model. There's all this stuff about being O2, and you got to be confident, and you got to have intellect, and you need to achieve results, and you got to build a team. But then as soon as somebody makes a mistake or they get in trouble, like all of that gets thrown out. All the coaching, mentoring, and training goes out at the window, because it's like all of a sudden this huge cloud of fixed mindset, and because they got in trouble, I have to protect myself. I have to CYA, right? Cover my own ass, cover your ass. And you distance yourself from that individual, and that's like the prime opportunity to step in and be like, hey, let's figure out what's going wrong with you so that we can, get you on the path to success, just move you forward, whether it's for the military or not.
It's interesting too, yeah, where we will judge someone's entire character based on one thing, right? People make mistakes and you can let them make a comeback. But then on the flip side, I have also seen where people make these huge mistakes that are damaging to an organization or a unit. Then they start to make their comeback and they're lauded among everybody else when you're like, they made a great comeback and that's great. But also there's all these other people who have been doing great things the whole time. So can we also acknowledge that piece?
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. There's two things I got out of that. One is the award thing and then age. So I'll start with the award thing. So there's a soldier that just took care of people during the Texas's like Snowmageddon. And then there were some other individuals inside the organization that I don't know what they did, right? From the outside looking in, it just looked like they did the same things. Or what they did is they were very vocal about the things they did. From a coaching aspect, it's one of those where I tell people like, hey, you have to know your people. You got to talk to them to understand what makes them tick, because then one of the things that will happen is you may find out that they're doing something. The other point was you were talking about kind of like age. And I think that's one of the things in the Army that just experienced recently, where there's this like paradigm that if you're older and seasoned in the military, you make better decisions. And if you're not, then you don't. And the discussion was around the training with industry. We kind of discussed this, but I presented like, why don't we open up training with industry to ranks below staff sergeant? And the immediate response from the senior leaders was, no, we can't do that because they're not senior enough, they're not seasoned enough, they're not mature enough. And so what they did in that response, without even thinking about it, is they completely disregarded the fact that people are coming into cyber more educated, they're older, and more life experience. And they also disregarded the whole, what about all of the issues of senior leader misconduct? Just because we've always made a lot of opportunities for the senior ranks is not what today's Army is. And so you need to, when you're coming up with something to offer to soldiers, you need to account for the makeup of what the Army is now when people are coming in.
Those more junior people, that's how they get more experience, is when you're letting them actually have experiences. It's so cheesy, but in the movie Finding Nemo, when Marlin, the little dad fish, is saying, I promised him nothing would happen to him, or I wouldn't let anything happen to him. And then Dory says, well, that's a silly thing to promise. If you never let anything happen to him, nothing will ever happen to him. But I think it's such a good point about, where we try to protect certain things or certain people or shield people from different things. We get into this weird mentality of let people walk through things, you're going to see what kind of choices they make. And then instead of taking them out at that point, again, coaching them through it. And how do we make them better from this?
And then to take this all the way back to the very beginning about the coaching, I'm really big on opportunity. If you do the right things, you will give yourself the opportunity to be successful, to make choices to be successful. And so by doing the many things that I do, the talking to individuals, just getting to know them, I multiply my opportunity to be successful and help the organization grow, individuals grow, the more interactive I am. Why would I learn everything that I do, go through everything that I do, and have all that knowledge, everything I share, right? It's all about that intellectual power. I choose not to use intellectual power as a way to protect myself. I prefer to use that intellectual power for good, right? And to just to help others get to a point where maybe they'll have it flip in their mind. It'll be that catalyst that'll catapult them forward so that they can take over from me. So anybody that is at the end of your podcast, so the challenge would be, if you're in an environment where like you go to lunch and do that kind of thing, you should never take an hour lunch and spend more than 45 minutes of it to yourself. You should almost be at the point where like, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna have enough time to eat, because you just took the time to talk to your workforce.
In this episode, Tony and I touched on a lot of topics, including growth versus fixed mindset, developing leaders, and mentorship. To explore these concepts more for your own self-development, I would invite you to journal about a few questions and a quote. The first question is, what situations cause you to go into a fixed mindset? And the second question, as a leader, what areas do you need to do further development in, and how are you going to go about getting that development? The quote I have for you is from social psychologist Adam Grant, who said, "The most meaningful way to succeed is to help others succeed." Thank you for listening to this episode of Equipping Leaders. All of the resources mentioned in this episode can be found on my website, natashacheyenne.com, as well as timestamps to help you get right to the resource that you are looking for. On the website, you can also find a weekly leadership journal entry, a resource page with challenges and downloadable content, a place to sign up for my weekly newsletter, and an upcoming leadership platform full of workshops. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha and on Twitter and Facebook at Natasha Cheyenne. If you'd like to hear more about a specific topic, please reach out and let me know. Join me next week for another episode.